All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Pandemic Classroom. So this is going to be our episode on Alexander and the Hellenistic culture. We're also going to be covering some of the Greek philosophy in here. So stay tuned and enjoy. So first up, if we're going to talk about Alexander, we need to talk about where Alexander comes from. So we have his handsome father here, Philip, known as Philip II or Philip of Macedon. No, not actually missing a nose in real life, however, was missing an eye. Uh, don't always trust Greek architecture or rather Greek sculpture. They will mislead you with their naturalism. So the Macedonians, Macedonia, Macedonia. You're going to hear it interchangeable based on different pronunciations, whether it's the kind of modern English or you're going by Latin pronunciation, Latin or Greek. So Macedonians lived in a northern part of Greece on the Balkan Peninsula. And the Greeks, the traditional Greeks in Athens or Sparta, would have seen them as barbarians. Philip II comes to power during a civil war. He had been held as a hostage in the city of Thebes, a political hostage. So he's kind of there as an insurance policy to make sure that the Macedonians don't do anything silly while we're in charge. He's educated and trained as a Greek, both Greek scholar and soldier. So he's certainly a very capable individual, and would have been important in this time period. The other interesting thing to note about Philip is when he takes power. In Macedon, he ends up marrying this kind of significant woman named Olympias, who's sort of tribal. In fact, they referred to her almost as a witch. And we'll be talking about her down the road too, briefly, and then I'm going to link a podcast to this that goes into more detail with Mr. Carlin. But Philip's definitely an interesting figure, definitely led from the front in the battlefield, built the Macedonian army to what it was known as. Philip is really this figure who kind of sets up all of the area for Alexander to be great, which we'll get to. And there's definitely some studies that say maybe Philip was the one who was actually great, and Alexander just sort of took the keys to the car. That's a debate we can have because it's certainly interesting. So that brings me to Alexander himself. Macedon is too small for you. Supposedly a quote from Philip to Alexander. So Alexander's born in 356. He is of course, the son of Philip II and Olympias, his queen, one of his queens, and he is credited as having created the largest empire ever made by a single man. The Macedonian Empire is not as large as like the Roman or the Mongol Empire, but by a single man, most amount of territory. So he had pretty much conquered the known world by the time he was 29. So he started 18 to 29, about 11 years, 12 years in some cases to kind of consolidate all of that. That's an incredible feat. I'm 30. I look at what Alexander did by the time he was my age, and it's just like, I haven't conquered anything. I've really got to get on this. So Alexander starts his career at about age 18. If we go back earlier than that, there's portents that say he's going to be great. He has Aristotle as his tutor. He's working with kind of the best soldiers to train. His father has created this companion cavalry to mimic the Theban Thousand, or the sacred Theban band. There's all of these elements that pull into Alexander kind of having the machine with him to do the work. He, at age 18, leads the Greek cavalry, the companion cavalry in combat, and that really. So the Greek military force is made of essentially two units. You've got the infantry in their phalanx formation with their extra long spears known as sarissas, and they're the anvil of the army. Then you have the companion cavalry, these 4,000 light armored troops with spears and swords, and they are the hammer. So they drive the enemy into the anvil and just kind of crush them. And you'll see Alexander uses that technique over and over again. I'm going to put a couple documentaries up if you're interested. Some of them are great, and it's definitely worth a watch. So Alexander had done all of this conquering by the time he's 29. So he's taking Greece and consolidated Greece. He's taken Asia Minor, Egypt, Persia, India, and he does all of this because his father has died. Some implicate Alexander himself, or especially his mother, in the assassination. So Philip was actually assassinated at, I believe it was his daughter's wedding. Could be wrong about that, but I think it was his daughter's wedding. He's assassinated by one of his own bodyguards, and then that bodyguard runs to get on his getaway car, his horse, and he is murdered. So he's killed before he can say anything, confess anything. So we don't know. We don't know what happened, or who set it up, or who financed it. But Philip is dead. Alexander is kind of thrust into power almost immediately, and he's busy putting down revolts. And there's a bit of bloodshed here where Alexander goes through, and he's even said to have found some of the conspirators, killed them on his father's tomb. It's pretty grim stuff, but the Macedonians are like a Grecian mob family, so you let them get away with some of this stuff. It brings me to the death of Alexander. So Alexander died in 323. He conquers all of this territory, turns around in India because his men are tired of marching. They want to go home. Goes back to Babylon, which is sort of his palace in this area. Has this, throws a real rager party, supposedly. Gets sick and dies. Now, there's conflicting stories as to how he dies, whether it's poison or drinking too much, because Alexander's definitely known for drinking. But Alexander dies in 323. Most likely from some disease or something. A fever is how it's described. So a couple things to note here. Things that Alexander had done in his life that are, other than conquer the world, that are reasons that we think of him as an interesting figure. So you've got the taming of Bucephalus, which was his horse. And he named a city after his horse. Several after himself, one after his horse. But Bucephalus is this horse that could not be tamed by anyone his father had bought. Alexander supposedly discovers that the horse is afraid of its shadow. He turns it to face the sun. From then on, only Alexander can ride Bucephalus. There's the undoing of the Gordian knot. Alexander shows up in Asia, and there's this knot that was supposedly tied by King Midas himself. It says, whoever can undo it will inherit all of Asia. Of course, it something that no one could untie. Alexander ponders for a moment, draws his sword, cuts the knot in half. Ropes fall to the ground. He had undone the knot. Then there's the siege of Tyre. Tyre was this city basically on an island. They had a citadel out there. Alexander built a bridge out to the island most of the way, and used his fleet that had sort of been taken to attack the Tyrian Empire, or their city at least, the Phoenicians, kind of break them. He is proclaimed Pharaoh of Egypt when he shows up there. They don't want to fight him, and he's, as Pharaoh, he becomes a god. Then Alexander starts this proskynesis, making his men bow before him. That didn't go over well with a lot of the Macedonians. He also forces about 1,000 of them to get married to Persian women, which, nothing wrong with Persian women, but being forced into marriage, probably not something most of them were looking forward to. And then, on top of all of this, you have Alexander's drinking. That really caused him some serious issues. In fact, he actually ends up killing one of his own generals because he was drunk. Throws a spear through him. Alexander was young when he took power. It's a lot of power to put in the hands of an 18-year-old, expect him to do the right thing. It's just incredible to think that he did what he was able to do. And when we look at some of the decisions that he made, he definitely was an outside-the-box thinker. There's this famous incident, I think it was at the Battle of Issus, where Alexander's outnumbered, and he had asked his general, what should we do? Should we attack in the morning or at night? His general said, well, I would attack at night, catch them off guard while they're sleeping. Alexander says, well, you are Parmenion, and you would attack at night, but I am Alexander, so I shall attack at dawn, because I am not Parmenion. Turns out the Persians thought like Parmenion. They stayed up all night waiting for an attack that didn't come. Tired in the morning, Alexander's army shows up, crushes them. So, there's evidence or stories like that tell us about how great Alexander was. But that brings me to the question of whether or not he was actually great. Upon his death, his final words were, "To the strongest." So his army becomes kind of divided. His generals start to fight over land, and there's civil war, and there's lots of assassinations and political intrigue. But eventually, you see his kingdom being split into three, known as the Ptolemaic kingdom. So you've got Antigonus taking the Antigonid kingdom, Ptolemy and the Ptolemaic kingdom, Seleucid and the Seleucid kingdom. So you've got the Antigonid kingdom up there in Macedonia. Seleucus is the kind of green on this map, all of Persia, and then Ptolemy has orange, which is Egypt. Another interesting story here: Ptolemy has this kind of capital city of Alexandria, which is this beautiful city that's dedicated to Alexander. So Ptolemy actually hijacks the funeral of Alexander, which was on its way back to Macedon to bury the body in his family crypt. Ptolemy hijacks that, has Alexander buried in Memphis in Egypt, and then the body is exhumed from Memphis and moved to Alexandria when the tomb of Alexander is constructed. His body is actually interred there in a crystal sarcophagus slathered in honey. More on that later. So, Alexander, was he actually great? Well, depends on how you define that. Did he conquer the entire world? Yes. Is that something we consider great? I am probably one of the biggest fans of Alexander as a person of history because I find him extraordinarily interesting. However, I'll be the first to admit that once Alexander gets through Egypt, it's not so great a guy after that. He's kind of a dark person. He's a little bit twisted, all up in his head with, becoming a Persian king, and that's what he really ends up wanting to do. So, was Alexander great? I don't know, but he certainly changed the world. One of those major lasting impacts was the kind of the footprint left behind of Hellenistic culture. So that blending of Greek or Hellenic culture with Persian, Egyptian, Indian cultures to make a Greek-like or Hellenistic culture. City of Alexandria is a kind of prime example of that. So just to kind of bounce off that, some of the things you would find in Alexandria: the Pharos, the giant lighthouse, which we know was real. There's lots of different illustrations of it, but scuba divers and archaeologists have actually found evidence to suggest that was a real construction. You've got the tomb of Alexander, which has been lost to history. Maybe one of you will find it. I know that there's lots of digs going on that look for it, but you can only dig up so much of Alexandria. The city's still inhabited, and some parts of it they don't allow you or permit you to dig under. So it's a matter of finding it. The Great Library, a copy of every book, actually the original of every book, was kept here. So ships would dock, and they would, customs officials would board the ships, and they would go through and they would pull out any books that the captains had. They would take them to the lighthouse, take them to the library. Copies would be made, and then copies would be brought back, and the originals would be kept. Of course, there's a fire there, it destroys pretty much everything. And then the museum, which is a temple to the muses, the kind of Greek inspirations of poetry and art and dance and music. And the Serapum, which is a temple to the god Serapis, who was kind of a blended Hellenistic god, mixed Egyptian and Greek there. All right, so this brings me to the Greek historians. So we've got Herodotus, hero.us. Up here, he wrote the histories. You might remember we kind of looked at some of this the other day when we talked about the Persian War, which is really what Herodotus is writing about. And isn't that just a lovely cover? You getting that with that guy dipping that head into that vat? This guy standing behind him, just admiring all of that happening. It's great. Great read. It's actually a very easy book to read, I recommend picking it up or looking at the PDF copy that I shared with Google Classroom there. You also have Thucydides here on the right. Wrote about the Peloponnesian War. I think I gave you a quote from him when we were talking about the Peloponnesian War and particularly the Athenians. It was the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Straight out of Thucydides there. All right, so I've kind of pulled my face out of the way here so that you can see what we're talking about with the Hellenistic astronomers, some of the different Greek stargazers here. But you've got Aristarchus, who argued that the Earth was tilted on an axis and revolved around the sun. Crazy fellow. Doesn't know the world's flat. Yes, that is just a joke. Please do not think that I think that the world is flat. I do not. I do not think that. The Earth is not flat. It is not flat. Not flat at all. Not flat. Okay, so Ptolemy says that the Earth is the center of the universe. A little off there. Aristarchus was much more right, but Ptolemy does outline that there's orbits that the planets follow, so that's useful. Eratosthenes, I just think he's fabulous because I'm not a math person myself. So if you're a math person and you're listening to this, I'm sorry, something wrong with you, but that's okay. We'll get it worked out. But Eratosthenes was able to take the shadow cast by the Pharos and calculate roughly the circumference of the Earth. Now, he was wrong. He said that it was 25,000 miles, which is just crazy. Today we know it's actually 24,901 miles. So when you think about 99 miles off, that's really not bad at all, is it? Especially for some guy doing this, over 2,000 years ago. Final one there is Hipparchus. He's the father of trigonometry, so you have him to thank for that. But he also created the system of latitude and longitude, so I guess we also have him to thank for that. And so does your GPS and your phone's navigation system, and when you DoorDash and people are able to show up at your house with food. Thank Hipparchus for that one. All right, so that brings me back to talk about math. Yeah, math. Love math. So we've got Euclid here in Euclidean geometry, and I will tell you I do not have an expansive wealth of knowledge about Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometry. If you want to torture yourself about that, talk to a math teacher. I'm sure they'd love to discuss it. I know one that does. However, he did write kind of the fundamental geometry textbook known as the Elements, or the Elements of Geometry. So this book is kind of the early understandings of geometry, and that's where a lot of that math builds upon. Archimedes I know a little bit more about. Archimedes is an inventor, so he's known for his law of the lever, or lever, if you're British or want to sound fancy. So the law of the lever states that the longer the lever is, the less force that needs to be applied to lift something. Right, so here's the example I'll use. We're going to take my phone, make my phone the fulcrum, or the point in which the lever balances, and we'll take this pen. Right, so if you have the fulcrum in about the middle of the lever, you need to apply about the same force to one end to lift what is on the other. So if you're trying to lift something up, say you have 10 pounds here, you would need about 10 pounds of force to lift it. However, if you move the fulcrum and make the lever longer, you need less force to lift the weight because there's actually less motion that needs to take place. You have a greater range of motion here to lift this. So, a long enough lever and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world. So Archimedes, he's got the death ray, which you can kind of see in that bottom left corner, a series of mirrors or a giant mirror focusing light to make a beam that burns stuff, which is cool. Also plausible, according to Mythbusters. They did a whole episode on it. It's great. And then the water screw, which, if you think about how a screw goes into a wall, he would essentially use this in reverse to lift water. So water would kind of be scooped up in this screw, and as you turned it, it would be lift. There's lift to carry it up and deposit the water up above where you might want it. All right, I know you're all very sad to see my face keep disappearing. I'm sure that's probably one of the reasons you come here, but we can't always have that. Sometimes I have to give you the history. So this is Hippocrates, who is kind of the early Greek physician, father of medicine, sometimes called. And he is probably most famously known for the Hippocratic Oath, which is the oath that's sworn by doctors in both this time and that they still take one today. It's essentially an oath where you swear to do no harm. I'll read you a portion of it here. So it goes, I swear by Apollo physician, by Asclepius, by Hygienia, by Panacea, and by all the gods and goddesses, making them my witness, that I will carry out, according to my ability and judgment, this oath and this indenture. To hold my teacher in this art, equal to my own parents, to make him partner in my livelihood, when he is in need of money, to share mine with him, to consider his family as my own brothers, and to teach them this art, if they should want to learn it, without fee or indenture, to impart precept, oral instruction, and all other instruction to my own sons, the sons of my teacher, and to indenture pupils who have taken the physician's oath, but to nobody else. I will use treatment to help the sick, according to my ability and judgment, but never with a view of injury and wrongdoing. Neither will I administer a poison to anybody who is asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a course. But I will keep pure and holy both my life and my art. I will not use the knife, not even verily on sufferers from stone, but I will give place to such as are craftsmen therein. So, but stone is like kidney disease, like if you have a kidney stone. But anyway, that's Hippocrates there. So we'll just talk briefly about the Olympics. The first Olympic Games held in 776 BC, located at Olympia, hence Olympics. They're dedicated to the Olympic gods. Run uninterrupted for about 1,000 years, and then in 393 they're banned. Christianity had become pretty popular there, and I think 393 is actually the maybe the Edict of Thessalonica, the one that makes all other religions illegal. But the next Olympics would not be held until 1896, and they've been running roughly uninterrupted since. So some of those early events, you've got running, jumping, discus, javelin, etc. Pankration, I always like to bring up because this is a kind of like a MMA wrestling fighting type activity that the Spartans were prohibited from being a part of because it's a training technique they used in their military, and they tended to, if engaging in such practice, tended to kill people. So, no Spartans need apply for Pankration. All right, Greek philosophy, one of the things I enjoy talking about the most. Greek philosophy is just fascinating, but the word itself, philosopho, means the love of wisdom. So philosophy, or philosophers, are lovers of wisdom. So this is, a basis for a lot of things that we actually still use today. Our education system is somewhat based on the philosophic teachings of this period, especially how they taught philosophy. Inquiry-based thinking, right, where you try to puzzle out a problem by asking questions. Abstract thinking, being able to think about things that aren't necessarily right in front of you. So all of these ideas are handed down through Greek philosophy. You have sophists. These were like paid teachers, people who taught philosophy, people who taught rhetoric, which is the ability to speak or argue. These guys, kind of early teachers, and they're not necessarily, some of the greatest philosophers of all time, although some of the greater philosophers were also sophists at one time or another. Anyway, so let's get through some of these guys. So first up, we have Pythagoras of Samos. So Pythagoras is often referred to as like a mathematician. But he's actually a pre-Socratic philosopher, and he operated mostly on the Apennine or Italian peninsula. So he founded the Pythagorean school, and he believed that the universe could be explained through mathematics. So he had quite a cult following. He had lots of people who kind of joined up with him under his Pythagorean school and studied him and studied his ideas. And so there was music associated with this. He believed that music and mathematics were closely aligned. They even somewhat saw him as like a deity almost, which is kind of interesting. And he's credited with developing the Pythagorean theorem. However, that's not really something that he may have actually produced. The Pythagorean theorem was created using Pythagorean thought, but it may not have actually been created by Pythagoras. It may have been, um, another one of the philosophers in the Pythagorean school. Okay, so this flow chart here talks about some of the different philosophers throughout Greek period, and it kind of shows how they're interconnected, who taught who, and when they were, relevant. So I've got a few that I actually just want to talk about briefly. I don't want to spend any kind of 20 minutes here, even though we could actually spend lots of time talking about this, and maybe I'll share another podcast I have with you all, the philosophize this or something like that. But it's a philosophy podcast. It's quite interesting. But first person we'll talk about is Thales. Thales of Miletus, up there at the top. He's kind of one of the oldest philosophers we really know of in the Greek system. And so he believed that, and sometimes he's called the first scientist too, because this kind of inquiry-based philosophy actually becomes sort of science in some cases. Philosophy today is not the same as philosophy then. In fact, when you get a PhD, you get a doctorate of philosophy in whatever it is you get your PhD in. So you could have a PhD in applied engineering, but you are a doctor of philosophy. You understand the concepts of applied engineering. Anyway, so Thales believed that the Earth kind of sat on water. And that water was the origin of everything, water to slime to earth. And that's kind of how everything became. People, we have blood in us, so water is important to us. So, he was starting to kind of understand things. But what's most interesting is he tried to explain things without using the gods, which in the 600s BC was, just ridiculous. Nobody was doing that. I mean, this is 200 years before the Spartans were fighting the Persians. So he's definitely doing this in an interesting time. So, like earthquakes, he said that earthquakes were caused by waves rocking the earth. Is that true? No, but does it give us a pretty good understanding of how something could be explained without using gods? Absolutely. Next person I want to talk about is a little bit further down, Heraclitus. I like Heraclitus because Heraclitus introduces the theory of flux, that everything's in change, everything's in motion and changing as time progresses. So if you look at something like, I think he uses a river. He says you can never step in the same river twice because rivers flow, it's changing, and so life is like that. Heraclitus also may have died smeared in dung, eaten by dogs. He was suffering from dropsy, which is an old word for edema, which is when your body collects excess water. And he believed that since feces tended to dry out, get very hard, they would actually in some cases use it for fires. He thought if he coated himself in it, it would draw the water out of him, allowing him to survive. So in one story, he's actually torn apart by dogs while covered in feces. In another story, he just dies from dropsy, right, from that collected water. Democritus, I want to talk about him for just a moment too, because Democritus is an interesting figure with the atom. So Democritus, we can say, is responsible for atomic theory, sort of. He said that all things that exist are made up of teeny tiny particles called atoms. And that's the base element in which everything's made from. Then you have atoms that build the universe. Atoms are everything. And so he's right about that, essentially. Atoms are pretty much the smallest particle out there, and they do build up everything. Of course, they're not the smallest particle, but they build everything. It was wrong in saying that atoms can't be divided, but we didn't know that until 100 years ago. We divided the atom, so it's not crazy. But he also probably wasn't talking about the scientific thing that we have called the atom. We call it that because of him. He was just talking about the smallest elements that build the universe. So you have that. Last person I want to talk about is Diogenes the Cynic. I like Diogenes because Diogenes is interesting. He's a cynic, and he's associated with Alexander because Alexander said that if he were not Alexander, he would want to be Diogenes. And there's this famous interaction between the two. Diogenes was known for kind of laying in a street in a barrel. That's just kind of where he hung out. And the story goes that Alexander shows up and introduces himself. I'm Alexander, the great king. And Diogenes, doesn't seem too impressed. He says, I am Diogenes the dog. And Alexander asks him why he's called, why he refers to himself as a dog. And Diogenes says, because he's always begging and following people around, which is kind of interesting. And then Alexander is said to, basically have offered Diogenes anything he wants, asks if there's anything Alexander can do for Diogenes. And Diogenes looks up, says, you could step aside, you're blocking my sun. It's just kind of interesting that you're offered anything you want by the great king, this man who has conquered the world, and all you ask him to do is to move out of the sunlight so that you can continue to lay there and sunbathe. There's a famous picture where they actually kind of drew, I forget who the artist was, it's probably 18th century. They drew Diogenes and Alexander as dogs. So Alexander's this real proud white dog standing there, and Diogenes is kind of this scruffy mongrel kind of laying in a barrel. And they believe, actually, that Walt Disney used that as the inspiration for Lady and the Tramp. So, fun facts for today. Okay, so we have these Socratic philosophers, as they're often described. First one up is, of course, Socrates, for whom they're named. And so he's an Athenian, living in the 5th century BC. And most of his teaching is through discussion, through conversation, trying to, examine truths. And so he was considered an annoyance mainly by the people of Athens. And so he would use, Socratic questioning, that's what we call it today. Or, he would just ask questions and pester people, and people just were annoyed by him. But he said the unexamined life is not worth living. And that's probably one of the keyest points that are his. And of course, we're pulling that from Plato, because everything we know about Socrates comes from Plato, because Socrates famously did not write anything down. But he was declared a threat to the state of Athens. Because he's kind of charged with denying the gods and being disloyal to the city, corrupting the youth. He has all these charges levied against him. I think one of the things I find probably the most interesting is initially when they determined his guilt, whether he was guilty or not. Of course, there was some speculation, but he was determined to be guilty. And then he was allowed to speak about how he should be sentenced. And famously, he said that he believed he ought to be given free meals for life, because of the service he had done to the city. And actually, more people voted for Socrates to be executed than voted for him to be guilty. So just think about that for a second. But Socrates is sentenced to death, and he's offered, he's told, we can smuggle you out, you can run away, we can get you out of this, and he insists on following the law, abiding by the law. He had been determined to be guilty and to be executed, and so he was going to go through with that, and drank the poisoned hemlock and went on teaching, and eventually succumbed to the poison. All right, so here we have Plato, not Play-Doh, but Plato, who is a Greek philosopher, and he's a student of Socrates. And most of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato, actually. So Plato formed a school known as the Academy, and he recorded the dialogues of Socrates. So basically, he wrote down the things Socrates said, and he wrote this book known as the Republic. It's quite interesting. It covers a lot of things. Plato has some interesting theories about the way the world operates and the universe itself. He says, that we can only understand, kind of the really it's like the shadows of things. So he has this world of forms, and he says that we're all just an imperfect representation of a more perfect object in the world of forms. So like very basic, but like this pen is not a pen. It is the reflection of a pen that is perfect in the world of forms. So take for what you will. But in the Republic, he talks about philosopher kings and they're the guardians. So he also talks about the allegory of the cave, and I'll explain that. I just want to read you this first passage that introduces it. And of course, this is supposed to be out of the mouth of Socrates. He says, next, then compare the effect of education and that of the lack of it on our nature in an experience like this. Imagine human beings living in an underground, cave-like dwelling, with an entrance a long way up that is open to the light, and as wide as the cave itself. They have been there since childhood, with their necks and legs fettered, so that they are fixed in the same place, able to only see in front of them. Because their fetters prevent them from turning their heads around, light is provided by a burning far above them. Between the prisoners and the fire, there is an elevated road stretching across. Imagine that road. This road is in front of this road is a low wall, like a screen in front of people that is provided by a puppeteer, and above which they show their puppets. Glaucon, who is the other figure here, I'm imagining it. Also imagine, then, that there are people alongside the wall, carrying multifarious artifacts that project above it, statues of people and other animals made of stone, wood, and every material, and that you would expect some of the carriers are talking, some are silent. It is a strange image you are describing, and strange prisoners. They are like us. I mean, in the first place, do you think these prisoners have ever seen anything of themselves and one another besides the shadows that the fire casts on the wall of the cave in front of them? How could they if they were to keep their heads motionless throughout life? What about the things carried along the wall? Isn't the same true where they are concerned? Of course. And if they could engage in discussion with one another, don't you think that they might assume that the words they use applied to the things they see passing in front of them? Well, they would have to. What if their prison also had an echo from the wall facing them? When one of the carriers passing along the wall spoke, do you think they would believe that anything other than the shadow passing in front of them were speaking? I do not. All in all, then, what the prisoners would take for true reality is nothing other than the shadows of those artifacts. So, of course, that's an interesting theory, and thankfully we've never been able to really test that. But he goes on to say, imagine one of these prisoners escapes, gets outside, and of course the light's blinding, but they adapt to that, and they see what the real world looks like. They try to come back and tell the other prisoners about it. Hey, this world's great out there. There's all these things. We're not actually seeing the real world. We're seeing, these figures, but they're not real. The real world's out there. He talks about how the people they're in the cave think he's crazy and ridiculous and make fun of him for not being able to see the shadows clearly. It's just kind of an interesting proposition that people who do not receive enlightenment, who do not become more intelligent, who don't study, who don't learn, are to remain in the cave, and even though it's hazardous to our health, those of us who have escaped the cave should continue to try to go back and pull those people out. He says, we can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light. Plato for you. And finally, here we have Aristotle, who is a polymath. So he's somebody who's skilled in many disciplines and is a student of Plato. So he believes in the sensory world, the real world. He believes in learning through observation and investigation, kind of the early scientific method. He created a peripatetic school known as the Lyceum, which was basically a garden, essentially, of trees outside the forest or outside of the city, and you could walk through the Lyceum, and that was his school, this forest grove. He wrote a series of books, so I've got a couple of them here. I've got the Organon, which is kind of it's a massive book that really talks about all different concepts of his, dealing directly with ethics, essentially, and philosophy. We've also got politics, which is a good one. My copy of rhetoric is actually at the school. It's an interesting place to keep it, but it'll be home this week, hopefully. And then the last one is the Nicomachean Ethics. I'm going to read you just a short selection from this. I always thought this was interesting. Well, actually, there's really kind of two. One of them is one that I guess you would say Mr. Farkas and I discuss. We found it interesting, so I'll read you that one first. It says, this is why a youth is not a suitable student of political science, for he lacks experience of the actions in life, which are the subject and premises of our argument. Moreover, since he tends to follow his feelings, his study will be futile and useless. For the end, political science is action, not knowledge. It does not matter whether he is young in years or immature in character, since the deficiency does not depend on age, but results from the following of his feelings in his life, in a given pursuit. For an immature person, like an incontinent person, gets no benefit from his knowledge, but for those who accord with reason in forming their desires, and in their actions, knowledge of the political science will be of great benefit. And then the point I wanted to read, I like this section. It says, and of course this is a quote from Hesiod, I believe. He says, he who grasps everything himself is best of all. He is noble, also who listens to one who has spoken well. But he who neither grasps it himself nor takes to heart what he hears from another is a useless man. I just kind of thought those points were interesting. But foundational text for ethics is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it, right? To think about someone else's ideas without taking it as your own. Aristotle for you there. He's interesting for sure. Not always right, but certainly interesting. Okay, so these are the last two. These are true Hellenistic philosophers. You've got Zeno and Epicurus. So Zeno is the founder of Stoicism, which is really kind of about, just sort of go with the flow, try to be in control of your emotions and your desires, and life will pan out. There's a Roman emperor named Marcus Aurelius who writes a book called Meditations. It's fantastic, but it's a Stoic text, so it's good to read to kind of get an idea of how Stoicism operates. And when we get to Rome, I'll pop a link up there for it. Epicurus, the founder of Epicureanism, says that the only things that are real are those that we can perceive with our senses. So we should just go enjoy everything that's real. Sort of just like have a good time, man. That's Epicureanism. It's very hedonistic, very very much so about worldly pleasures. And the last, of course, the image I have up here, the Colossus of Rhodes, another wonder of the ancient world, also a blending of that cultural difference. You've got Helios, the sun god, in there, so it's quite an interesting figure. It's also reminiscent of Lady Liberty, isn't it? So that brings us to a close with the Hellenistic world and some philosophy tossed in. I hope you all had a wonderful time, and see you next time.